The Astronauts continued by Stanislaw, translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. The Great Spot. It took us 16 days to examine the upper atmospheric layers. I say days because although the valley was shrouded in deep darkness, our organisms maintained the 24-hour rhythm of sleep and wakefulness. Together with the physicists, I set up radar devices and reflectors for ultraviolet rays. We also launched balloon probes that recorded the ionization density. The built-in automatic transmitters transmitted the results of the measurements to us. In the laboratory, Rainer conducted the analysis of the minerals that Arseniev and Lao Tzu had collected in the dead forest. Chandrasekhar was engrossed in complicated calculations. I eagerly awaited the break of dawn, because the more important plans had been postponed until then. Outside it was still very cold. The ice cover of the lake formed an ideal smooth surface, for the hurricane had been followed by absolute calm. Luminous streaks flickered through the clouds, reminiscent of the haze-filled northern lights. On the 20th day a terrible storm roared across the valley. Lifted by the waves, the ice shattered and splintered. The sides of the rocket trembled. Coarse hail rattled against its walls, but not the slightest breeze penetrated the cozy interior. The following day it became calm and quiet again, and as the frost subsided, the mercury column in the thermometer rose to 4 degrees below zero. The barometer began to fall. Dawn approached, and with it new, severe thunderstorms were expected. Arseniev therefore ordered the lodge. As we stood on the back of the rocket for the last time, the sky was covered in a leaden grey. The dull reflection lay on the ice that had once again bound the lake. Then the hatches closed, and the engines began to roar. The ice cracked with a thunderous roar, and its pieces were hurled high over the front of the rocket. Jets of fire whipped the water. The cosmocrater rose steeply upwards, leaving a trail of white spray behind it. Between the cloud, torn to shreds by the flames of the exhaust gases, the silhouettes of the mountains and the gorges filled with blue shadows appeared dimly. We spiraled ever higher through thick layers of cloud. Suddenly everyone in the control center covered their eyes. A white glowing disk, floating deep in the clouds, flared up on the televisions. As we flew east, we met the sun several hours earlier, as it rose over the lake. The cosmocrater set a course for Earth, as if it were about to return to the abyss that separates the two planets. The navigators, however, only guided it to the stream of radio waves that brought messages from our home, Earth. For several hours we cruised through the void of space, beneath the black star-filled sky we hadn't seen for so long. Then, like a diver searching for the bottom, the rocket disappeared back into the clouds. From time to time, small hatches in the floor opened, from which auxiliary radar antennas were lowered on long cables. Induction devices scanned the fog for metal veins. Vibration analyzers in both laboratories registered and split the radar waves reflected from the planet's invisible surface. The instructions I had received from my navigation service indicated that we were heading for the Valley of the White Sphere. Around 11 o'clock, Arseniev appeared at the control center. Whenever I asked him something, he only answered after a long time, as if he were thinking about completely different things. He glanced at the instruments and asked me to pay particular attention to the readings from the gravimeter. Notify me immediately if any changes occur, he said. There certainly won't be any, Professor, I replied. We won't exceed a speed of 3/4 of a kilometer per second. That has nothing to do with our speed. Amazed by this reply, I couldn't hold back a remark. Why, you can read the magnitude of gravity on the gravimeter, and the force with which Venus attracts us is always the same. It's not the planet's gravity, Arseniev retorted impatiently. Please follow my instructions. I shrugged and looked at the gravimeter. The needle didn't move. I knew, however, that Arsenyev wasn't giving unreasonable instructions. It was a mystery to me how the force of attraction could increase, but I did my duty and looked at the instrument dial from time to time. Half an hour before my release, I received a telephone order to climb to 40 kilometers. According to the compass and radar, the valley of the white sphere couldn't be far away. The engine noise grew louder, and just a few minutes later the cosmic crater shot above the clouds. The roundness of the planet was clearly visible. The puffy clouds stretched to the edge of our field of vision, lying below us in long furrows, like a snow-covered field. Suddenly the buzzer sounded loudly. One of the fuses in the line supplying the power to the second laboratory had blown. One of the scientists was surely responsible for this. I turned the power back on, which had been automatically interrupted, and turned to the Predator. When I approached the screens, I noticed that their brightness had dimmed somewhat. The clouds had become darker. They shone silvery, the lower part flat, the upper part curved. That's how they moved along. They moved in the same direction as the rocket. After a while, a funnel opened in the middle of the clouds, smooth and gigantic. It seemed to reach into the interior of the planet, a maw that sucked the clouds into itself. I could hardly look any more. Everything around me was swaying and turning. One by one, the feathery clouds that flooded near the cosmic crater disappeared. They plunged into the depths with such speed as if an invisible fist had hurled them down. The clouds beneath us melted into a metallically smooth, dense mass and were caught in the fused vortex of the abyss. I felt my body grow heavy. At the same time, the roar of the engines turned into an ever higher wind whirl. The predictor continually increased our propulsion power to counteract the increasing gravity that threatened to pull us into the funnel. It was a gigantic whirlpool whose diameter I estimated at over 100 kilometers. The cosmic crater spread over it on a secant trajectory. I looked at the gravimeter. The force of attraction was still growing. I didn't need to report it to Arsenyev, for he must have noticed, even without instruments, that all his limbs felt as if filled with lead and the slightest movement became an effort. The center of the crater was getting closer. The rocket did not deviate even a fraction from the secant it was describing. Only the engines emitted a sharp whistling sound, as if they were suddenly decelerating at high speed. At that moment Arsenyev entered the control center, followed by Soltik and Rayner. Of course, just look, that's the big spot, cried the astronomer. The big spot. Yes, you remember that shortly before landing we noticed a hole in the cloud cover. We lost sight of it back then. Well, here you have it again, but from a shorter distance. The valley of the white sphere must be nearby, I interjected. Not just nearby, but right below us. There, the professor pointed to the dark bottom of the crater. From all directions, long trains of cloud, with billowing mains of mist, raced into the black opening. Who's on duty? Asked Arsenyev. Engineer Soltik will relieve me now, I replied. Good. We're already moving away from the center of attraction. When gravity drops to 2G, we'll begin circling the valley. Smith, you'll hand over to Soltik now, and then please come to Marks. When I entered Marks's cabin for a few minutes later, the companions were already gathered. Lao Tzu was behind the desk. Arsenyev was standing next to him, looking at some drawing. Rayner was busy with a projector. So we're now circling the large spot, said the astronomer, putting the papers aside. It's an artificial gravitational field that's dragging the clouds down like a whirlpool. Please, colleague Rayner, we can begin. The lights on the ceiling went out. On the wall, a square screen lit up, showing a greenish image. It looked like a wheel hub with a rim of spokes. Some spokes were slightly wavy. This is the network of underground pipes that supply energy to the white sphere, the astronomer's voice sounded in from the darkness. Compared to the magnetic pole, this sphere can be called a gravitational pole, because it creates artificial gravity fields. You have before you a kind of X-ray photograph that we took a quarter of an hour ago from the height of 80 kilometers through the planet's crust. Gradually our eyes had become accustomed to the fluorescent flickering of the screen, and we noticed that the lines of the pipe were not equally sharp everywhere. The blurred lines were caused by the fact that the ground did not offer the same resistance to the penetrating rays on all sides. The mountain ranges surrounding the valley appeared as darker, stronger stripes in the image. The lake was barely visible. It could only be guessed at in the center of the screen. The light was somewhat dimmer there. Where the tubes converged, a blackish dot stood out, the sphere. We assume, the astronomer continued, that this huge energy center is closely connected to the alleged threat to our home planet. I don't want to get lost in details, since we now only deal with the technical side of the upcoming research, so let's just leave it at a brief introduction. As already mentioned, shortly before landing, we observed a dark spot in the cloud cover, which, however, slowly dissipated after a few hours. When we arrived in the valley 3 weeks ago, the white sphere was not active. Admittedly, it caused the destruction of the helicopter, but compared to the peak of its activity, the tensions prevailing at that time can be described as resting. Its activity is currently intensifying, as can be seen from the juxtaposition of these three facts. The intensity of the force field of the white sphere is subject to fluctuations. It will be of utmost importance for us to determine whether they are periodic in nature, that is, whether these fluctuations form self-contained cycles that constantly repeat at certain intervals, or whether they occur irregularly and chaotically. All our further endeavours depend on the decision on this question. We will wait in the air until the intensity has significantly weakened. Then we will settle on the lake and set up measuring rods on its shores. As you can see, 11 current-carrying tubes converge beneath the sphere and supply the energy required to build up the field. These currents can add up or cancel each other out, depending on the frequency of the pulses, the phase shift, the voltage, and so on. You know that the tubes are buried deep in the ground. We will place an oscilloscope above each tube to record the pulsation of the current. Analyzing these recordings will allow us to solve our problem. You can turn on the light, Doctor. The screen went out, and at the same time the light flared back on. The brightness came so suddenly that it blinded us. The astronomer stepped to the desk and continued. This task is less complicated than dangerous. The activity of the sphere can increase again at any moment, and we do not know what influence rapidly changing gravitational fields have on the human organism. It is quite conceivable that crossing certain zones could prove fatal in the event of a sudden jump in the field, P field strength. Furthermore, it is possible that such a rapid, abrupt change in the gravitational potential could cause various phenomena still unknown to us. For example, a sudden heating of the ground, changes in air movement, deviations in the refraction of light. Under these conditions, especially in the difficult rocky terrain around the white sphere, we might lose our orientation. We will therefore work in groups of three. Two will go from apparatus to apparatus in turn, while the third observes them from a certain distance and maintains contact with them using flares. Arsenyev distributed printed sheets among us. This is the work plan with the division into groups of three. Osvetich, Lao Tzu, and Smith are the first to leave to make the technical preparations. He was interrupted by the ringing of the onboard telephone. Lao Tzu picked up the headset. The intensity of the field is decreasing. He turned to Arsenyev. Very rapidly. Soltic reports that storm clouds are gathering. Arsenyev took the papers from the desk. That would be consistent with our assumption. The decrease in gravity must be accompanied by thunderous electrical discharges. Does anyone have any more questions? Yes, I said. Should I get ready for a reconnaissance flight? No, that's not necessary. We can just land on the lake. Kolgosvetich, the white sphere was designed by the inhabitants of Venus. Is it possible that we might encounter them there? You're asking too much. The white sphere appears to be remote controlled, but that doesn't rule out the possibility of an encounter. The planet's inhabitants are undoubtedly highly intelligent beings. We know nothing else about them, and therefore it's difficult to say what to do in the event of an encounter. I can only recall the principle that we all pledged to uphold before departure. The question of reaching an understanding with the inhabitants of Venus and eliminating the danger threatening our Earth takes precedence over the question of our personal safety. In other words, we are not only forbidden to attack, but also defend ourselves by force. We are also not permitted to destroy technical equipment. That would be all. Rayner and Osvetich left the cabin. Tarlin stopped me with a question. While I was answering him, I heard Chandrasekhar say to Arsenyev, "You shouldn't have refused me." "I refused you reluctantly, but it was necessary," replied the astronomer. "Someone has to work on the marks, and no one can do it better than you." "You call him my slave," said Chandrasekhar. "In reality, I am his slave. Apart from the three of us, there was no one left in the cabin. I really had no business being there any more either, but the two scientists didn't seem to notice my presence at all." Chandrasekhar sat behind the desk. Arsenyev approached the door, but suddenly hesitated. "About the fact that I have to stay on the rocket." He didn't finish and went out. His hands on the mark's keyboard, Chandrasekhar sat with his head slightly bowed, as if listening to the muffled sounds of the engines from deep within the rocket. "He's right," the Indian said quietly. "So do I." Even though he wasn't looking at me, I felt he was saying it to me. "You wanted to come with me to the shore, didn't you, Professor?" "Yes, I did. We're both right. That's how life is, and that's why it's harder than math." He touched one key, then a second. Grim, shimmering snakes writhed across the screens, began to tremble, split and swirl. The dull hum of the stream grew louder. I crept out. At 3 o'clock, after the storm had stopped, we arrived. The rocks along the shore were dark with wetness. A fine rain was still falling, and dozens of small streams rushed over the stony slopes, and tumbling from vertical sills, turned into waterfalls. The white sphere remained invisible even when the wind dispersed the fog. A forest of pebble needles, rising from the water and the gravel heaps along the shore, hid it from our view. The mountains appeared and disappeared again into the clouds, as if blurred by the steam rising into the air in white columns. The motorboat shuttled between the rocket and the bay. We brought equipment, accumulators, cable reels, pulling the lifting devices, and steel structural components ashore, from which a small mooring was assembled in the bay. This was intended to facilitate the unloading of larger loads. When this preparatory work was completed, Osvetich and I set out to circle the white sphere in search of the underground cables. We used induction devices. We were able to detect the echo of the first pipe below a broad rocky ridge above the bay. It was the cable that led to the southeast through the gorge, the crater, and the plateau to the basin of the lake with its iron shore. We marked this spot with a hastily erected pyramid of stones and moved on. Although the light rain continued to fall, the rocky ground remained dry. It must have been very hot, for as the drops fell, they evaporated. All the cracks and fissures in the rock were filled with blown-in sand. It was hard and coarse-grained. In a gust of wind, the entire scree field was covered in a single grey cloud of dust. As we descended from the raised area to the shore, we lost sight of the white sphere again. It must have been behind the pebble needles. Some of these needles reached a height of 30 meters. Their thick, smooth columns rose between treacherous boulders, which, despite their size and weight, were wobbly, and sometimes gave way under footsteps, like unsecured trapdoors. One after another we marked the spots where the oscilloscopes were to be placed above the pipes. The rain stopped, and here and there green windows opened among the clouds. The air became increasingly clear. Finally the wind swept the mist from the surface of the lake and spread them down the slopes of the valley. About a kilometre from the bay, a green patch stood out against the rocky debris on the opposite shore. The tent of the observation post from which Lao Tzu followed the progress of our work. After we had erected the last stone pyramid where the 11th pipe ran beneath a field of gravel, we returned to the rocket. Soltic and Raynor went ashore next. The weather improved noticeably. Dazzling white clouds drifted across the sky, which shone with the purest green. The sun repeatedly appeared between them, and then it seemed as if the entire landscape stretched and extended pleasantly under its radiance. The gullies and chimneys shimmered like blue ribbons on the gilded cliffs. The light was so strong that one could count the rock fragments on the far shore of the lake with the naked eye. Through the large tripod telescope, we watched from the back of the rocket as Soltic and Rayner reached the bay, docked, and climbed up to the rise. Below the rocky ridge, Lao Tzu stopped them and announced that the gravimeter was indicating further fluctuations in the field strength. At the same moment, the shore began to shimmer like curved glass. Flat rainbows hung in the air and floated on the water. The outlines of the distant rocks trembled like a flickering flame, fringed with light. After a while, everything calmed down, and the companions could begin their work. First one after the other, they reached the shore and, carrying one of the heavy oscilloscopes, climbed the steep bank again to disappear into the labyrinth of shattered rocks. After 4 hours, Rainer took over the observation post, and Lao Tzu and Tarlin went into the area. Soltic, who returned to the rocket by motorboat, reported that the strong roar of the streamers near the white sphere was disrupting the radio connection. Those working on land were then equipped with the flare guns so that they could communicate with the observer at the gravimeter at any time if the radio failed. By 6 o'clock in the afternoon, all the measuring devices were set up and now formed a ring around the white sphere with a circumference of almost 1.5 kilometers. Devices had to be checked every 2 hours, removing the films, exposing with the recordings, and replacing them with fresh ones. At 8, Osvitich and I brought the first rolls of film on board. Then Rayner and Soltic sailed to the bay. They, too, completed their task smoothly and brought the second film series to the Cosmic Crater. When he wasn't with Chandrasekhar at the marks, Arsenyev stayed on the upper deck of the rocket, monitoring the readings from the main gravimeter. The 10th hour of Earth's night was approaching. The sun winked through the curtain of delicate feathery clouds, and the water of the lake was so still and calm that even the slightest oscillation could be felt inside the rocket. When it was Osvitich and I'd take our turn again, a fluttering murky cloud of mist hung between the tips of the pedal needles above the white sphere, invisible from the lake. Lao Tzu, who was at the observation post at this time, warned us. We had already landed, with the signal of 3 red rockets and 1 smoke rocket. It seemed as if the sphere was awakening to renewed activity. Increasingly strong winds were blowing from the lake, and the temperature of the rocks along the shore rose by 20 degrees within a few minutes. At the same time, the roar of the subterranean currents made any communication by radio impossible at a distance of more than a few meters. The intensity of the field increased in small jumps, but then became constant again. The physicists signaled to us that we could continue. We climbed the rocky ridge. At the foot of its highest elevation, the first camera stood under a small canvas tent. We changed the films, which took a few minutes, and continued on our way. From the elevation, one could survey a large area. The air was extraordinarily clear and transparent. Only the farthest mountain peaks were shrouded in delicate veils of mist. Suddenly I stopped. Down there, the cracked stone surface with its needles, sandhills, and shattered slabs was empty. Osvitich, look, I cried. The white ball has disappeared. Osvitich looked behind it. The hell, what is that? Wait a minute, I said. I remember clearly that this large plate under the 3 needles used to be to the right of the sphere, and the small rock cone to its left. And now the plate lies next to the cones. There isn't even a gap left. Where did the sphere actually lie before? Even if it had sunk to the ground, there would still have been a pit, a hole, an empty space. We stared at each other, perplexed. What now? I asked. We turned toward the mountainside, where the tent of the gravimeter, no larger than a match head, stood out against the grey ground. I tried to call the physicist on the radio, but only heard a loud crackling noise. So I fired a white rocket and 2 smoke rockets, which, according to the agreed-upon key, meant, "Can we go on?" Some time passed, and before a green star arose in the distance, and driven across the lake by the wind, slowly sank into the depths. Everything's fine, Osvetich stated. We turned around and both let out a cry of amazement and wonder. A huge bright dome surrounded by a wide empty strip, the white sphere rested, just as before, amidst the boulders. That was some kind of mirage, I finally said, not really believing my own words. Then I began to descend. We followed the cable connecting all the oscilloscopes and had to climb over large piles of rock debris. We stopped at each camera. I took out the exposed roll of film, and Osvetich inserted a new one from the supply he carried on his backpack. In just under an hour, we visited 9 cameras. The path to the tent led over a rise in the ground. To the left, the white sphere shimmered above the pebbles. To the right, the stone ridge was hollowed out like a mulberry. Boulders lay piled up in this depression. It looked like an abandoned quarry. Suddenly I stopped. At a distance of perhaps 100 meters, someone was sitting on a large stone. It was a motionless, dark, squat figure. Osvetich had a lead of about 20 paces. I called to him. He looked down and also stopped. Without thinking twice, I climbed down and ran across the piles of stones toward the figure. When I got close enough to see it clearly, I realized that it wasn't a living creature at all. A large, long, irregular piece of rock leaned against the stone slab. The glassy, brownish fracture surfaces shone brightly in the incident light. I wondered why this boulder could appear to me as a human-like figure. Only seen from above did it somewhat resemble a hunched, sitting body. It's a block of lava, I cried. Osvetich looked down at me. He certainly hadn't understood me, because the disturbances had become considerably stronger, so I signalled to him with my hand that I had showered. He turned around and walked on. Close by, the top of the tent, housing the tent oscillograph, peeped over the small stone pyramid. Wait, I called after Osvetich, and hurried up the slope. But he didn't wait for me. He moved on. Suddenly the entire space expanded before me, simultaneously shrinking in on itself, and it was as if I saw a reflection on a shiny sheet of metal that someone had unexpectedly bent. Then everything shimmered and undulated before my eyes, and returned to its previous state. I stood as if petrified. Osvetich had disappeared. Seconds ago I had seen his shoulders, his helmet. He had just stepped onto a large silvery stone slab, taken another step or two, and vanished, as if he had vanished into thin air. I gathered myself and ran towards the slab as fast as I could. Osvetich, I shouted. Osvetich. There was no answer. I climbed over the rubble, trying not to lose sight of the silvery stone slab. Finally, I reached it. The surface of the wide slab, which leaned toward me, was covered as if with frost. That was why it shimmered so. They were all small, sparkling crystals. In one spot, I spotted a long, whitish groove. The stone was quite soft. A shoe nail had left this mark. At first I thought Osvetich had jumped over to the other side. There was a bright niche formed by 2 boulders leaning against each other. Its floor was covered with fine gravel. A few pitch-black stones the size of a loaf of bread lay there as well. Osvetich, I called quietly. I had seen him just a minute ago, standing here on this slab. He hadn't gone straight ahead, but he couldn't have hidden in the niche either. The path led up a high rock, so I had definitely missed seeing my companion. I hadn't let this spot out of my sight for a second, and yet he wasn't there. Perplexed, I looked around. Where should I look for him? I ran among the boulders, calling his name, but only the creaking of electrical discharges answered me. I returned to the top of the rise to launch a rocket. As I raised the flare, I noticed that the white bullet had disappeared again, just as it had an hour ago. The opening of the deep ravine between the slopes hadn't been visible until now. The white bullet had obscured it. I felt like a boxer rising from the boards after a heavy punch to the chin. I wanted to rush to Osvitich's aid, to seize the danger that threatened him. But there was nothing there, neither Osvitich's nor any visible, recognizable danger. As a sign that an accident had occurred, I launched a red rocket. Then I sat down on the edge of the silvery slab of rock and watched impatiently as two dark dots appeared, slowly crawling up the scree slope and gradually approaching. They were two figures in scuba gear. I saw them hurrying to get closer. They ran wherever the terrain allowed. Finally, they disappeared behind the pebble needles. After 40 minutes of agonizing waiting, they were with me, Lautzi and Soltik. When they heard what had happened, Soltik jumped to the edge of the ledge and shouted as loudly as he could, Osfidich, Shenyan! It's no use, I said. He's gone there. Here's the mark of his nail. Soltik bent down and looked at the rock. A whitish scratch ran diagonally across the shiny surface. Nothing else. He stepped harder here, I explained, and scratched the stone. It can't be any other way, so where did he go? Soltik was agitated. I shrugged. Lautzu had climbed a little higher. Without taking the binoculars out of the helmet window, he asked, Which of you is carrying the exposed films? Me. Do you have them in your backpack? Yes. Did you change the film in the tenth machine? No. Osfodich was just about to go there too. Good. The physicist stepped down from the rock slab and walked toward the tent, which shimmered green beneath the rock a few dozen steps below. Soltik, meanwhile, ran over to the niche behind it. For heaven's sake, he muttered, turning in all directions. What does that mean? So this is where he was standing, he asked me again. Yes, there. Come, he said. We now systematically search the whole damned area. I looked back at him. He was just lifting the round black stones. Had the situation not been so tragic, his actions would have seemed simply ridiculous. Lao Tzu called me. I went downstairs and noticed that the Chinese man was standing quite strangely, leaning at an angle, as if he were about to lose his balance at any moment. Yet he was standing firmly on his feet. I wanted to ask him what that meant, for I felt myself leaning just as steeply. Professor, I cried, just look how. What is that? We don't have time to explain now. He gave me the film roll he had taken from the camera and slammed the lid shut. Now the last oscilloscope. Behind the rock. Hold, please, he said, handing me his measuring device. Soltik approached us. He stopped, looked at us silently for a while, then asked in a trembling voice, Professor, what are you doing? Now you're thinking about films? Films? Lao Tzu didn't answer. He knew as well as I did that at this moment no help could be asked of Soltik. The professor walked away. I looked at Soltik. A gusty wind tugged at the folds of his somewhat too baggy protective clothing. The engineer stared fixedly at the slab of rock where I had last seen Osvitich. Lao Tzu returned after just a few minutes. He pressed the film roll into my hand. Go to the shore as quickly as possible and take the motorboat to the rocket. Professor Chandrasekhar is waiting for the films. It's very urgent. And you? I asked. We'll stay here. Will you look for him? Go, please, said Lao Tzu. His gentle voice had a steely undertone. I ran as fast as I could, not even slowing down, where the stones lay loosely on top of each other and slipped with every touch. A vague, distant roar was in the air. Through the combination, I felt a hot wind. From the surface of the lake, which peeped out from behind a long sandbank, languid clouds of steam rose. As I ran, I heard a strange smoke. The rock warmed, as if an invisible fire were burning beneath it. I hesitated. What should I do? Run back and get them? I looked around. It was getting darker and darker. The wind was driving thick clouds of steam from the lake. His ragged breath was hot, as if coming from a large furnace. But I had to get those damned films to the rocket, and so I ran on, leaping from rock to rock, finally out of my breath, my sweat streaming down my face. I reached the motorboat and jumped in with such a leap that it rocked and gushed water. I raced towards the rocket at top speed. On the upper deck of the cosmic crater, a man was pacing back and forth, his hands behind his back. A crazy thought struck me that it was Uskovich. I swung myself onto the stairs and was up in an instant. Arsenyev stood there. The Jupiter lamp surrounded our silhouettes with a sparkling cross of rays and cast large drifting shadows into the fog. Where are the others? He asked. They stayed on the shore. Osvitich has disappeared. What do you mean disappeared? Arsenyev asked angrily. Did he fall in somewhere? No, not that. He simply disappeared. I saw him standing on a large boulder very close to the tenth machine. The air suddenly shimmered, and when I tried to run to him, he was no longer there. But there are no crevices there. It's a completely smooth surface, and the depression between the rocks isn't very deep either. And the white sphere? What? I'm asking if you saw the white sphere. No, it disappeared too. So, said the astronomer. He was silent for a while, then raised his head. Do you have the films? Yes, Professor. I couldn't hold back any longer. Professor, we have to go to the shore. They'll burn up there. As I returned, the rock became hotter and hotter. I. Lao Tzu is over there? Yes, Saltic too. Please take the films for the marks. And our companions? They'll know how to manage. I could just. The second motorboat is on the shore. You aren't needed there. Please go. I climbed down the iron rungs after the compressed air had forced the poisonous Venusian atmosphere out of the lock. I went to the Marek's cabin in my diving suit without first removing my helmet. I stood by the door and watched as Chandrasekhar slid the film rock reels onto a long horizontal axis, inserted the ends of each reel into a gap in the console, and operated several switches. The films quickly unwound and disappeared into the depths of the machine. Chandrasekhar touched several buttons. The fluorescent screens glimmered one after the other like giant sparkling eyes. Red and blue pilot lamps blinked and soon emitted a light so bright that it masked the greenish flickering of the fluorescent screens. A singing roar filled the cabin. Green flashes flickered across the screens, and again, the short clicks of contact could be heard. The needles of the measuring instruments swung to the overload limit, but the mathematician still pressed new keys. Sometimes the transformer hummed loudly, struck by a current surge, or an arc hissed behind the wall at the switch terminals. For a while, Chandrasekhar stood motionless in front of the Marek's, head bowed, squinting at the flickering, sparkling lights, then stepped aside. He examined the screens once more, then turned to me. Now, Marek must show what he can do. Do you understand what this is all about? The gravitational fields are created by the superposition of individual current pulses. Using Fourier analysis, the dozens of billions of oscillations that the oscilloscopes recorded on the film. I've had enough. Leave me alone, I cried. Osvitich has disappeared. Chandrasekhar flinched. What has happened? I described this entire sequence of events in chronological order. While Chandrasekhar listened, he incessantly watched the fluorescent screens. Involuntarily, I followed his gaze. The lines that snaked across the side screens gradually faded and merged with the phosphorescent background. Instead, a strip of light became increasingly clear on the central screen. Lao Chu was over there, Chandrasekhar asked when I had finished. Suddenly, the rushing of the stream fell silent. The control lights went out, the side screens brightened, and on the central one a steep double-curved curve rose. Chandrasekhar's eyes sparkled. So it's periodic after all, he exclaimed. Then a pale, apologetic smile flitted across his lips. It must seem unhuman to you that I, in this situation. He broke off, swayed, took a step back, and leaned against the shiny side of the desk. The light falling from above shone on his sunken temples and cheeks. Only now did I realize that he hadn't left the Marks at all recently. Day and night the red light above the cabin door shone. That doesn't matter, he said. You'll return when... He didn't finish the sentence. Where is Arsenyev? Upstairs. Would you like to call him here, please? Tell me it's very important. I met the astronomer on the upper deck. Bent over the gravimeter, he was intent following the needle's readings. Next to him, the column-like white beam of light from the refractor reflected, dissolved into the thick haze. So the intensity isn't increasing, Arsenia said quietly, as if he hadn't heard me. I therefore repeated that Chandrasekhar was asking him to come down. Suddenly he sat up. So, is it all ready? Well, what kind? I didn't understand what he was actually asking me. Then I remembered the mathematician's exclamation and answered at random, a periodic one. Without another word, Arsenyev ran to the lock. Should I go to the shore? I asked him. He stopped. No, you can't help us here there. Please keep an eye on the radar and the reflector. The flare gun is there on the side. He dived into the lock shaft. The valley was enveloped in hot mist. The rocket's body stood out against it, black like the body of a dead whale. Next to the searchlight stood the portable radar. Its two elliptical antennas were aimed at the shore. I grasped the control circuit with both hands. The rocket point above the bay, over which the companions had to return, became visible to the screen. It was dull and empty. A few clouds of smoke, darker than the fog, drifted across it. I looked at the photo element inserted under the screen. It showed the temperature of the shore rocks, 260 degrees. My fingers clenched around the metal handle of the scale. 260 degrees. The air temperature had also risen sharply. It was getting hotter and hotter. 80, 85, 90 degrees. How long could a person, even in an insulated protective suit, endure this? The minutes passed, each one seeming an eternity. The hissing of the water, which began to boil as it touched the scorching hot shore rocks, sounded overhead. I turned the antenna from side to side, about to adjust it, when something flickered in my field of vision. A person was walking over there. I pressed the alarm and jumped back to the radar screen. The black spot slowly pushed its way through the rock trimmers, disappeared for a while, reappeared, and broke up into two smaller but strangely distorted figures. Soon I could see it clearly. Two people were carrying a third. They were struggling to reach the motorboat over the rocks that protruded from the water. Between the last rock and the boat, however, there was a thin strip of water. They stopped. Apparently they weren't discussing anything. How I now regretted not having crossed over. Contrary to the astronomer's orders, I could have helped them. I called out, gave them advice. I didn't realize that they couldn't hear me. Suddenly one of them had shrunk in size. I realized he was bending down and trying to pull the motorboat toward me by the rope that tied it to the shore. On the radar screen, I saw that this was impossible. There was a reef just below the water surface. Alone, they could have easily jumped the 1.5 meter gap, but the third. I was about to run to the gangplank when the one who had been pulling on the rope gave up further attempts, turned to his companion and signaled to him. Both picked up the motionless body and, carrying it high above their heads, stepped into the boiling hot water. They waded through up to their hips and were hidden for a few moments by clouds of steam. Then they threw their companion into the boat and climbed in themselves. Again, endless seconds passed. Finally, the water churned and the boat began to move. Why are you shouting? Well, listen, why are you shouting like that? Arsenia said to me. After a while, behind him stood Talin and Chandrasekhar in scuba gear. I didn't even realize I was laughing and shouting with joy. And then the motorboat docked at the gangplank, and all three of us ran down. Not me, I can do it alone, Soltik groaned, as I reached out my hand from the last rung to help him. I can do it alone, quickly, Professor Lau. His scuba gear is torn.